A millionaire gives $350 to a beggar woman and the next day sees her at the grave of his girlfriend, who died 23 years ago. When the millionaire finds out the truth about the beggar woman, he is shocked. And when you watch this story till the end, tears will come to your eyes. Before that, please subscribe to the channel. It was a cold November afternoon when James Crawford, a successful businessman with more money than he could count, was walking through a quiet area of town. James was a millionaire, sharply dressed, with a demeanor that never wavered. Life was a race for him. He won it with great effort, but the price was that he left behind his feelings, memories, and people who had once meant the world to him. When his car stopped at an intersection near an old cemetery, James's attention was drawn to a figure on the sidewalk. She was a frail woman sitting in the cold wind. There was a tired face on the sidewalk. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and her face was a canvas of exhaustion and despair. Her hands were outstretched, holding a small, faded cup that was catching all the dirt and debris blown by the wind. She wasn't speaking loudly or making a spectacle of herself. She was just sitting there, watching the cars go by, her eyes on James. James rarely had moments of charity, but there was something about her that struck him. Perhaps it was the way her tired eyes met his own. A quiet plea for help, or perhaps it was an echo of something deeper he couldn't understand. Without much thought, he reached into his wallet and pulled out $350. It wasn't a large sum of money by his standards, but in the context of her life, it was probably more than he had seen in many days. He rolled down his window and handed her the money. She didn't jump up in gratitude or make a scene. Instead, she simply looked at him, a slight smile forming on her lips, and she said, "God bless you." Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but the words sounded heavy. A strange chill ran down his spine with the words, not just in the air, but in his mind as well. He left, but the encounter stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit. He brushed it off as an impulse, a brief moment of charity that would not affect his life. But something about her, her presence, kept nagging him. The distance he had kept between himself and the world of feelings, of human relations, had now diminished a little, and he could not ignore it. The next day, something stirred inside James Crawford, something he hadn't felt in years. It was a strange pull, an undeniable sense of nostalgia which led him to the cemetery, a place he hadn't visited in a long time. The cemetery where his once great love, Emma, was buried. 23 years had passed since she had tragically died, but the pain never fully faded. James had learned to live with it, burying his grief under layers of work, ambition, and the pursuit of success. For all his wealth and power, he could never fill the hole Emma's death had left in his heart. Emma was more than just a memory. She was the love of his life. They had met in their early 20s, and it hadn't taken long for them to fall madly in love. They were inseparable, planning to marry, imagining a future filled with laughter, dreams, and children. But those dreams were shattered in an instant when Emma died in a car accident at just 25. Her sudden death had sent James spiraling. He had thrown himself into his work, using ambition as a distraction from the emptiness he felt inside. Amassing wealth became his way of coping, of finding meaning in a world that no longer held Emma. As James walked through the cemetery, a flood of memories washed over him. He felt a familiar pang of sorrow in his chest as he approached Emma's grave. He had avoided this place for so long, afraid of the emotions it would dredge up. But today, something was different. It was as if an unseen force had pulled him here, compelling him to confront the past he had tried so hard to escape. As he neared the grave, his steps slowed. His breath caught in his throat. There, kneeling at Emma's gravestone, was the same beggar woman he had given money to the day before. She was no longer the hunched figure asking for spare change on the side of the road. Now her hands were clasped in prayer, her head bowed in deep reverence as if mourning. James's heart began to race. His mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. How could this woman, this stranger he had encountered only yesterday, be here at Emma's grave? Why was she praying at the resting place of the woman he had loved so deeply and lost so painfully? His thoughts spun in confusion. Was it a coincidence? But no, something about this felt too deliberate, too personal. He stood frozen for a moment, watching her, his emotions swirling between shock and a deep, unsettling curiosity. This woman, who seemed so disconnected from his life just a day ago, was now inexplicably tied to his most intimate and painful memories. Eventually, the woman must have sensed his presence because she slowly lifted her head. Her eyes met his, and once again he saw that same deep sorrow reflected in her gaze. But now there was something else, something he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just the sadness of a life lived on the margins. It was as though she carried the weight of a shared grief, a connection to Emma that James couldn't yet understand. As he approached her, the woman did not notice him at first. She was immersed in deep prayer, her eyes closed, hands clasped tightly. But as he came in front of her, casting a shadow on the grave, she slowly raised her head. Their eyes met again, and this time James could see recognition on her face. She remembered him. "You?" James began, but his voice was faltering. He wasn't sure how to begin. "What are you doing here? How do you know Emma?" The woman blinked a few times, as if trying to gather her thoughts. There was surprise on her face, but not shock. It seemed as if she had expected this confrontation, though perhaps not so soon. She fidgeted uncomfortably before finally speaking. "My name is Margaret," she said, her voice soft and slightly trembling. "I don't know her, at least not personally. I come here often to pray." James felt a jolt of disappointment. It wasn't the answer he wanted, and it didn't explain why she was at Emma's grave. His mind was racing, trying to find some kind of explanation. Was it a coincidence? Or was she lying? There was something in her voice that sounded strange, like she was holding herself back. "I saw you here," James insisted, his voice getting even louder. "You were at her grave. Not just anywhere in the cemetery. At her grave. Why?" Margaret's gaze lit up with an emotion he couldn't quite understand. She bit her lip, looked down at her hands, which were shaking slightly. "I have no ill intentions," she mumbled, standing up slowly. Her thin body seemed even more frail in the cool autumn air. I was drawn here, that's all." Drawn here? The sentence echoed in James's mind. He wasn't entirely sure of it. It was too strange, too coincidental that she would be at this particular grave, the resting place of the woman who meant everything to him. But when he saw her, standing there with her head bowed, there was a frailty in her that made it hard for him to move on. She didn't seem dangerous, and yet her presence disturbed him in a way he couldn't explain. James stood silently for a moment, considering his options. Part of him wanted to demand answers, to force her to explain why she was attached to Emma's grave, but another part of him, one he didn't fully understand, was stopping him. There was something in her eyes, a sadness that was so similar to his own, that made him hesitate. For now, he decided to let her go, but the nagging feeling that there was more to this woman wasn't leaving him. "I'll be back," Margaret said softly, as if sensing his uneasiness. "I come here often. You will see me again." With that, she turned and began walking down the cemetery path. James watched her retreating figure, her figure small and fragile against the tall graves. His mind was still awash with unanswered questions. Who was this woman? Why was she at Emma's grave? And why had she said she was drawn here? As Margaret walked away, James felt a strange desire to know more. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their meeting, that somehow this woman was connected to his past in ways he hadn't yet been able to see. For now, though, he could just watch her go, leaving him alone with the ghosts of his memories once more. Later that evening, James couldn't quiet the whirlwind of thoughts spinning through his mind. Margaret's face, her mysterious presence at Emma's grave, and the strange feeling that their lives were somehow entwined, it all haunted him. He found himself pacing through his large, empty house, restless, unable to shake the nagging sense that there was more to this story than he could comprehend. Desperate for answers, he decided to search for some piece of Emma's past that might give him clarity. James made his way to the attic, a place he rarely visited, where old boxes of memories lay untouched. He rummaged through piles of forgotten keepsakes, old photographs, letters, and trinkets that he hadn't been able to face since Emma's death. Finally, he stumbled upon something he had avoided for years: Emma's journal. It was a small leather-bound book, worn and soft to the touch. He had kept it all this time but had never had the strength to read it. Sitting down with the journal in his hands, James hesitated for a moment, afraid of the emotions it might stir, but his curiosity and need for answers won out. With a deep breath, he opened it, and there it was, her handwriting, delicate and flowing across the pages. He began flipping through the entries, and with each page, he felt a bittersweet ache in his chest. The early entries were filled with joy. Emma had written about their love, their dreams, and their plans for the future. It was like stepping back in time to when everything felt possible, when they were full of hope. But as he continued reading, he noticed a shift in the tone of her writing. Towards the later entries, the happiness was tinged with something darker, a hint of sadness he hadn't been aware of back then. And then, in one of the last entries, James saw a name that made his heart stop. Margaret. Emma had written about a friend named Margaret, someone from her past. She described Margaret as a troubled soul, a woman who had been through unimaginable hardships. According to Emma, Margaret had experienced homelessness even back then, and Emma had tried to help her in any way she could. She wrote about giving Margaret food, a place to stay for a while, and offering emotional support when no one else seemed to care. But Margaret had disappeared from Emma's life shortly before she and James met. Despite Emma's best efforts, she had lost touch with her, and it had been a source of sadness for her. James stared at the page, his heart pounding in his chest. Could it be? The Margaret Emma had written about, the friend she had lost. Was she the same woman he had seen yesterday, the same beggar he had given money to, the same woman praying at Emma's grave? The realization hit him like a wave, and he felt a chill run down his spine. It couldn't just be a coincidence. Margaret hadn't simply been drawn to the cemetery. She had been drawn to Emma. She must have known. She must have come here to visit the woman who had once been her lifeline, her friend. James sat in stunned silence, the weight of this discovery pressing down on him. All this time, he had thought of Emma's death as something that belonged solely to him, something that had shaped his life in profound ways. But now he realized that Emma had touched other lives too. Margaret had been one of those lives, someone who had once been important to her, someone who had suffered and disappeared into the shadows of life, only to resurface all these years later, connected by the same thread of loss. Tears welled up in James's eyes as he closed the journal, the image of Margaret and Emma together flashing through his mind. He had always thought his love for Emma was a private, solitary grief, but now he understood that her memory lived on in others too. Margaret's presence was not just a strange twist of fate. It was a reminder of the impact Emma had on the world around her, on people who needed her kindness. James knew he couldn't leave things as they were. He had to find Margaret again, to understand her connection to Emma fully, and perhaps in doing so, find some healing for the both of them. Determined to uncover the truth about Margaret's connection to Emma, James couldn't let go of the strange encounter. The journal entry had left him restless, driving him to seek answers. The next day, he went back to the cemetery, hoping to find Margaret again, but she wasn't there. Frustrated but unwilling to give up, James began visiting local shelters, asking around about the frail woman he had seen. Days passed, and with each inquiry, his determination grew stronger. The pieces of this puzzle were scattered, but he was certain Margaret held the key to understanding Emma's past, and perhaps his own lingering grief. Finally, after nearly a week of searching, he found her. Margaret was living in a rundown building on the outskirts of town, a place that seemed forgotten by the rest of the world. The structure was barely standing, its walls cracked and worn by time, a stark contrast to the luxurious life James had built for himself. He stood outside for a moment, gathering his thoughts, before knocking on the door. It creaked open, and there she was, the same woman he had seen praying at Emma's grave, only now she looked even more fragile, the weight of the world hanging on her shoulders. Without wasting time, James spoke, his voice edged with urgency. "Did you know Emma? Were you part of her life before I met her?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears almost instantly. She didn't answer at first. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. James felt his chest tighten as he watched her struggle to find the right words. Her hesitation, her grief. It all pointed to something deeper, something far more complicated than he had imagined. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Margaret whispered, her voice trembling, "I knew her. More than you could ever imagine." James's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air, but they only deepened the mystery. He had always thought Emma's kindness was boundless, that she had helped those in need simply out of the goodness of her heart. But Margaret's tone hinted at something more, something personal. Margaret's hands shook as she wiped away her tears, struggling to hold herself together. "Emma saved my life when I was at my lowest," she continued. "She took me in when I had nowhere to go, when the world had turned its back on me. She gave me food, a place to stay, and hope when I had none." James's throat tightened. The image of Emma caring for this woman, offering her the same love and compassion that had drawn him to her all those years ago, was overwhelming. But Margaret's sorrow went beyond gratitude. There was something more, a secret that she had kept buried. "What are you trying to say?" James asked softly, his voice cracking with emotion. "What is it that I don't know?" Margaret took a deep breath, her face pale with the weight of the truth she was about to reveal. "Emma wasn't just helping me out of kindness," she whispered. She was my sister." The words hit James like a tidal wave. He staggered backward, unable to process the revelation. Emma had never mentioned a sister. In all the time they had spent together, she had never once spoken of Margaret or her troubled past. And now, after all these years, he was learning that the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he had mourned for decades, had carried this secret with her. "Sister," James echoed, his voice barely audible. The shock was overwhelming and he struggled to make sense of it. How could he not have known? Why hadn't Emma told him? Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with both sadness and relief. "She was ashamed," she said quietly. "Not of me, but of our past. We came from nothing, our parents. They weren't good people. Emma worked hard to escape that life, and she didn't want to burden you with it. She wanted to start fresh, to leave the pain behind, but she never stopped caring for me. Even when I disappeared, she never gave up on me." James stood there, reeling from the revelation. Everything he thought he knew about Emma suddenly felt incomplete. She had loved him, but she had also carried the weight of her family's pain, a weight she had kept hidden from him. Now, standing before Margaret, her long-lost sister, James realized that Emma's love had been deeper, more complex than he ever could have imagined. Tears filled his eyes as the reality of Emma's hidden life settled into his heart. James felt like the ground beneath him was giving way. Margaret's revelation struck him harder than he ever could have anticipated. The Emma he had loved, the woman whose memory he had cherished for over 2 decades, had kept such an important part of herself hidden. His legs felt weak, and he staggered back, leaning against the wall for support. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, colliding and swirling into a storm of confusion and disbelief. Emma had a sister who had lived a life of struggle, hardship, and loss. How could she have kept this from him? The woman he thought he knew so well, the one he had shared dreams and intimate moments with, had carried this secret all along. And now, the frail, homeless woman standing before him was the only living link he had left to Emma. Margaret's face softened with the weight of her own guilt. She could see the pain in James's eyes, the way he was grappling with this new truth. "I know it's a lot to take in," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "But Emma didn't hide this from you to hurt you. She wanted to protect you. We grew up in a rough place. Our parents weren't kind, and I made a lot of mistakes. I was the troubled one, always getting into bad situations, while Emma was the golden one, the one who kept her head high, who got out of that life and built something better for herself." Margaret paused, wiping away the tears that had begun to stream down her face. "When we were younger, I resented her for it. I made poor choices, fell in with the wrong crowd. We had a falling out. I didn't see the world the way she did, and I thought she was abandoning me. I lost myself in that resentment, and by the time I realized how much I needed her, she had already met you." James listened, his heart heavy with the weight of Margaret's words. He could see it now, the path that had led Emma to keep this part of her life hidden. Emma had always been someone who carried the burdens of others quietly. She had never wanted to weigh anyone down with her pain, especially not him. He could imagine her, young and determined, trying to build a future with him while shielding him from the darkness of her past. Margaret's voice broke through his thoughts. "Emma didn't want to burden you with her family troubles. She wanted to be free of all of that, to give you the best version of herself. And I wasn't part of that version. I was the mess she had left behind. I tried to get my life together after we lost touch, but I couldn't. I fell deeper and eventually I lost everything. By the time I came back to find her, she was gone. I missed my chance to make things right." James's chest tightened. The idea that Emma had carried this hidden grief with her, the weight of a lost sister, a broken family, was almost unbearable. He had loved her deeply, but now he realized that he had only known one side of her, the side she had chosen to show him. The thought that she had kept so much pain to herself, out of fear of burdening him, left him feeling hollow. "I should have known," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been there for her in a way that would have made her feel like she didn't have to hide any part of herself." Margaret shook her head gently. "You loved her, James. That's all she ever wanted from you. You gave her a chance at happiness, something neither of us thought was possible back then. Don't think that she didn't appreciate that. She loved you deeply, but she also carried the past with her. And some things are too hard to share, even with the people we love the most." James stood in silence, his thoughts swirling. Margaret's words had shattered the illusion he had held on to for so long. The idea that he had known everything there was to know about Emma, that their love had been without secrets. But now, as he looked at Margaret, he realized that life was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Emma had lived with the weight of her past, just as he had lived with the weight of her loss. In a strange, bittersweet way, finding Margaret felt like reconnecting with a part of Emma he never knew existed. The woman he had pitied just days ago was now the only living connection he had left to the woman he had loved more than anything. And in that connection, there was a glimmer of hope. Hope that he could still honor Emma's memory, not just by remembering the life they had shared, but by helping the person she had once tried so hard to save. Margaret's voice wavered as she continued, the pain of years of regret weighing heavily on each word. "When Emma died, I was shattered. I didn't know how to go on. I wanted to come to her funeral, to say goodbye properly. but I was too ashamed. After everything I'd put her through, I didn't feel like I deserved to be there, to mourn her with the rest of you. I felt like I'd failed her, like I wasn't worthy of calling her my sister anymore. She paused, her gaze dropping to the floor, unable to meet James's eyes. But I couldn't stay away forever, so I've been visiting her grave ever since, always in secret. It was the only way I could still be close to her. James's emotions surged, a chaotic mixture of anger, sorrow, and guilt. He looked at Margaret, this woman he had pitied just days ago, thinking she was a stranger, someone disconnected from his life. And now he understood. She was Emma's sister. The two of them had shared a bond that he had never known about, and now Margaret was living in poverty, haunted by a past she couldn't escape, while he had lived in luxury, oblivious to it all. Unable to hold back his pain, James sank to the ground beside Margaret. His mind raced, searching for answers, for reasons. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked, his voice breaking under the weight of his emotions. "Why didn't she ever say anything about you, about your past?" Margaret met his eyes, her own filled with sadness and guilt. "She wanted to protect you," she said softly. "From me, from everything we came from." Emma had a way of taking the world's burdens on her shoulders without letting anyone see. She didn't want you to carry the weight of our past. She wanted you to have a perfect life together, a life without the darkness that we came from. She loved you too much to let that shadow fall on you. James's heart clenched at her words. He had loved Emma deeply, but now he realized just how much she had sacrificed to keep that love pure. She had shielded him from her pain, from the parts of herself she thought would hurt him, and in doing so had kept a part of herself hidden forever. As he sat beside Margaret, the reality of Emma's untold story settled heavily on him. Emma had tried to protect him, but the cost of that protection had been her silence, and now all that was left were the pieces of a life he had never fully understood. In the days that followed the revelation about Margaret and Emma, James found himself questioning everything he had built. For years, he had focused solely on accumulating wealth, throwing himself into his business, believing that success and money would somehow fill the void Emma's death had left in him. But now, with the truth of her hidden past unfolding, he realized that his pursuit of riches had only isolated him from what truly mattered: human connection, love, and compassion. James couldn't stop thinking about Margaret. Despite all she had been through, despite the hardships she faced daily, she had carried on with remarkable strength. She hadn't asked for anything from him, hadn't even asked for sympathy, yet she had borne the weight of her own grief and guilt all those years, visiting Emma's grave in secret. He admired her resilience, her quiet dignity. It was a strength that reminded him of Emma. Determined to help, James reached out to Margaret, offering her financial assistance, a place to stay, or anything else she might need. He expected her to be grateful or relieved, but to his surprise, she refused his money. "Emma didn't love you for your wealth, James," she said softly with a sad smile. "She loved you for who you were, the man with a kind heart, the man who made her feel safe. You don't need to fix this with money." Her words hit James harder than he expected. He had spent so long using his wealth as a shield, something to keep him insulated from the world's pain. It was easier to give money than to give himself, to stay emotionally distant and focused on his business, rather than face the emptiness that had settled in his heart since Emma's death. Inspired by Margaret's quiet strength and the memory of Emma's selflessness, James realized he needed to make a change. For years, he had been living in a gilded cage of his own making. Now he wanted to reconnect with the world, not by using his fortune, but by giving something far more valuable: his time, his compassion, and his heart. He began volunteering at local shelters, the very places where Margaret had been staying during her hardest times. At first, it was uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being vulnerable, to really connecting with people who had lived lives so different from his own. But over time, James found a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. He listened to people's stories, offered what he could, not just financially, but through empathy and presence. Slowly, he began to heal, to see the world in a different light. As for Margaret, she and James developed a strange yet comforting bond. At first, their relationship was built on the shared grief of losing Emma, but as they spent more time together, they began to understand each other in ways that went beyond sorrow. Together, they would visit Emma's grave regularly, sharing stories about her. James would talk about the woman he had loved, full of life and hope, while Margaret would share memories of their childhood, of the sister she had lost long before Emma's death. These visits became a ritual, a way for both of them to keep Emma's spirit alive. Though their lives had been shaped by loss, they found solace in each other's company. They were, in a way, the last living connection to Emma, and through their bond, they kept her memory vibrant and present. James realized that while the past couldn't be changed, life had given him a second chance, a chance to find meaning again, not in wealth or success, but in connection, kindness, and giving back. It wasn't the second chance he had expected, but it was one he desperately needed. Margaret too found a form of redemption, knowing that through her connection with James, she was honoring Emma's memory in the way her sister would have wanted. Together they began to heal. Life moved forward, not without pain, but with the knowledge that sometimes healing comes in unexpected ways, through new relationships, new understandings, and the simple act of remembering those we've lost with love.